I am Thomas Bowles, Ag Agent from Prince William County, and I am for the soil, for the future, and for the planet.
Welcome, everyone, to For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee, and we are releasing this podcast on Tuesday, December the 5th, and that is a very important day, not only for our organization, but for farmers and gardeners and people all around the world. December the 5th is World Soil Health Day, and it is a very special day indeed. It was organized with the focus to bring attention on the importance of healthy soil and also to advocate for the sustainable management of soil resources. So I know you'll join us all as we celebrate Tuesday, December the 5th as World Soil Health Day. And we are celebrating by having a recap of some of our previous guests on the podcast. Let's get right to it. Well, our first recap on this special World Soil Health Day edition of the podcast, we really had a fascinating conversation, in my opinion, with David Montgomery and Anne Bikle. I wanted to ask you about the title of one of your previous books. Of course, your most current book is What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. But one of your previous books is called Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. And that kind of makes a presumption that the soil is not alive, because if you have to bring it back to life. So talk about the life of soil. How do we bring it back? Is it dead? How do we even measure that?
Yeah, the soil life is, you can think of it in many ways as the bacteria and the fungi that are in the soil. That's not all that's in soil life. There's worms and other things down there as well. But a lot of the really key members of the soil communities that matter to agriculture and ultimately human health are the bacteria and fungi in the soil. And some of our conventional farming practices have actually degraded that soil life, both through causing loss of the soil itself, soil erosion, but also through changing the community composition of soil life by degrading and altering the communities that are actually in the soil. And the two primary mechanisms for that are tillage and the over-reliance on things like synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, both of which alter soil communities in ways that can impact the way that things like mineral micronutrients and vitamins get into crops, or the way that crops will manufacture phytochemicals, chemicals they make for their own defense or communication purposes to maintain their own health. But that ultimately have effects in the human body when we eat those crops that are beneficial to us. So one of the things that I think is very interesting about soil life and soil health is that if we think about healthy, fertile soils as being soils, as Anne was saying, that are rich in organic matter and that have a healthy complement of species that can collaborate with crops, that can partner with crops to acquire for them things like mineral micronutrients and spur vitamin production and so on. The kind of farming practices that we would use to build soil health, to build soil organic matter, turn out to be the same kind of practices that we would use if we wanted to increase the mineral micronutrient content or the vitamin content or the phytochemical content of our food. So the way we treat the land ultimately ends up affecting what gets into our crops and our livestock and into our bodies that can help us maintain health or not, depending on how we actually farm.
And then Anne and David, I think in your study, you also talk about like the role of soil health and nutrient density. I think you started looking at nutrients and vitamins, but then as you spoke, David, that also the importance of soil life, the phytochemicals, essential fatty acids. And then I'm always reminded of a previous guest, Chris Lawrence. I think we all know that he makes the comment that you need to mulch your soil, you need to mulch your gut. And, that speaks to really keeping that biology moving. But I'd like to hear how you went about looking at nutrient density.
Anne, you want this one or do you want me to do it?
Go for it. I'll pipe
Okay.
up.
We looked at the effect of farming practices on nutrient density in a couple ways. One, we looked back at the scientific literature and just read everything we could find that was possibly related to the subject. And we've divided the book into thinking about, the connections of farming practices on soil health, then the effects of soil health on crop health, effect of farming practices on livestock health, and then how that all rolls up into human health. And one of the questions that we're left with is that there aren't a lot of studies that have used soil health as sort of the metric to gauge things against. So we conducted a little pilot study of looking at 10 paired farms around the US, regenerative farms and a neighboring conventional farm, where we looked at both the soil health on those farms, and we tested a limited amount of the crops coming off those farms, where they grew the same crop in the same climate and the same soil type, but they've been treated differently for at least 5 to 10 years, and looked at what we saw as differences. And the bottom line is that we saw consistently that the regenerative farms had higher levels of soil organic matter, about twice as much soil organic matter on average in the topsoil. So we're just looking at the topsoil. And then also they had a 3 times the soil health score with the Haney soil health score. So there's more an abundant and diverse life that was more active and more organic matter in the regenerative fields. And then on the crop end of things, we saw that there's a fair amount of variability, as you might expect. But on average, the regenerative crops had something like, I think about 20% or around there on average, high levels of phytochemicals. And in terms of vitamins, it depended on which vitamin. I think there's 34% more vitamin K and more like 14 or 15% more vitamin C and E, if I'm recalling right. But in other words, we saw some evidence that the crops grown in healthier, fertile soils had higher abundances or higher nutrient density, more of the micronutrients that help to benefit human health.
I think that one of the interesting things when you talk about nutrient density, that whole concept is that we're getting plant and animal foods that have both an abundance of whatever particular thing that plant or animal food might be known for, but you're also getting those things in the right proportion. And so just take, for example, the fat balance in animal foods. What you really want is, a balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fats. You don't want, a whole lot of one and hardly any of the other. So nutrient density has this sort of dual definition in terms of you're looking for proportionality, you're looking for good levels of things, and you're also looking for foods that, remember, we don't want toxins in our food. So I always like to bring this up when we talk about nutrient density. There's what you do want in there in the right proportions, and there's what you don't want in there because that's just not going to do us any good. So I think one of the things about the small study that we did not find in the research that we did in other reviewing all of these other papers is that it's really important to look at soil health on 2 adjacent farms that are both growing the same crop. Too often study designs are just taking a crop from here and a crop from some other farm and saying, well, let's look at what these differences are. But they haven't really also at the same time done some kind of an assessment of soil health. And so that we were able to do soil health, neighboring farm, and same crop. Also point out that this was not a big study and that we, have learned everything that there is to learn about this. This is just like, maybe one tiny layer of that proverbial onion that we started to peel back.
Well, David and Anne would be interested, it's obviously very complex and nuanced and, but for your average consumer who's reading this and then trying to think, okay, how should this and could this impact my decisions? What would you suggest?
Well, I'd suggest the healthiest diet would essentially be one that is rich in fresh whole foods grown or raised on healthy, fertile soils. How make sure you're getting that can be a little more challenging that I'll let Anne answer.
Pitching me the hardball. Okay. Here's, I think it's really important. And I know in your guys' neck of the woods, there's a lot of farmers and there's farmer markets. And anytime you can get a direct line to a producer, whether that is, for crops or your animal foods, starting up a conversation or sending an email, or if you're at a farmer's market, just asking, what can you tell me about your production practices? And, if you have a farmer, I think this would be pretty unusual, especially at a farmer's market, but if you have a farmer looking back at you with kind of a blank look, you probably want to move on from there and go put that same question to another farmer. And most producers are more than happy to talk about their farm and their practices. I know that whenever I get into a conversation with a farmer, here at my favorite farmers market in Seattle, I feel like I'm there with them on the farm. And of course, I'm a person who asks a lot of questions, and they never hold back. And because they really know, anytime you're working with the land or you're working with animals, it's just chock full of experiences and observations and all of that. So I think asking questions, and if there's certification programs that are robust and reliable, that you also, think about that.
David Montgomery and Anne Bikle. Another interesting conversation we had was with a young lady by the name of Clare Tallamy. At the time that we had our conversation with Clare, she was the reigning champion for world soil health judging. Yes, number one in the world. And we asked her to describe this competitive event. I'd like for you to tell us about the competition. This was held, I believe, in Scotland.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
Help our listeners envision, what do you do at a soil judging competition? And I've heard the word pit mentioned several times in this competition. Describe all that to us.
Yes. So pits in these contests are pretty big. Some of them in Scotland were pretty small because of how, I guess, treacherous the landscape was. I can probably send you guys photos to post, but some of these pits were the size of me. So probably my favorite photo is me laying with I'm completely flat on the ground and my front half is in the pit. And then my back half is outside of the pit laying on the ground. And I'm just like digging sideways to try and get the soil out of the side of the pit because it's too small for me to get in. But usually they can fit 8 to 10 people. Virginia Tech has a large team, so we have photos of all of us standing in pits. There's like 15 to 18 of us, kind of stuffed in there like sardines. And they're about my height or taller, so think like 6 feet sometimes, how deep these things are, because soils go pretty deep unless they hit bedrock really early. So we're describing all the way down until we're hitting those C or R horizons, which are parent material or rock or unconsolidated sand.
So like one team goes into the pit and you're doing this analysis, I guess, and we can get a little bit more in depth into that. And then another team comes in and another team comes in. And how many pits are there? And
yeah, so we just had our regional contest last week, for example. So that one, we described 4 pits in one day, and we're kind of broken up into rotations. So I'm actually not with my team when I'm doing these contests. I'm individually doing them. And so what will happen is I only have one teammate with me, and then there's a ton of other people from different schools, and we're put on rotations of usually 6 to 8 people in the pit at the time. And then the rotations go 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and then 20 minutes.
Clare Tallamy, who at the time of our conversation with the young lady from Virginia, she was the reigning world champion for soil judging. Another conversation we'd like to share with you is a conversation we had with Lee Rinehart. He's with the National Center for Appropriate Technology.
Lee, a project that you are very involved in, as well as Eric and myself, is this Soil for Water. And we've talked about the benefits of building soil health and the role of integrating livestock. And I know that has a large grazing component in it. Wondering if you could just tell a little background about the project in its goals.
Yeah, so this project started back in 2015. If people can remember, kind of take your focus and put it down southwest, Texas was boiling. I mean, they were experiencing a really bad drought that they're really still in right now. I was in Texas in May, and I was on a farm that had not had but 2 inches since November of 21, and that was insane, right? So he was having to irrigate, drip irrigation and such on the vegetable farm. But back in 2015, the drought really hit hard, and there was a lot of destocking. And so a lot of actors came together and said, well, what can we do, especially within the central part of Texas, what they call the hill country? It's a semi-annual, a semi-arid type of rainfall of 15 to 20 inches of rainfall per year, right? Sometimes they're only getting 5 inches of rainfall a year. But we want to say, how can we develop regenerative soil management systems that would just allow us to capture every bit of rainwater that we got? And we can do that, and we know that we can by using regenerative grazing practices that allow for more carbon to be put into the soil to act as a soil sponge. You can hold that water, and plants in a grazing situation can last for an awful lot longer through a dry spell if they have a lot of soil cover, if they have not been overgrazed, and if you've got really good organic matter in the soil holding that water in, keeping the temperature down. Well, you can actually carry over your grazing through hard times without having to destock as much as if you didn't do that. So that's kind of where we started. And then we said, well, you know what, if this works here, it's got to work everywhere else too, because everywhere there's agriculture and soil. So we brought Soil for Water through an NRCS grant, through a Southern SARE grant, to California and Colorado, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Virginia. And I am really pleased to be able to be working with Eric and Mary for the Virginia project. We also have Brent Wills, who is the president of the Virginia Association for Biological Farming, as another partner for the Virginia work. And so we're looking at Virginia and saying, how can we help producers and other organizations who are already doing wonderful work in there kind of come together and help to increase the adoption of sustainable and regenerative soil management practices. And in Virginia, the way I look at it is not so much for drought, although we have our drought times. It's more, how do I capture and keep all of that water that comes so that it doesn't go into the bay, and that so I can maintain productivity all the way through the summer.
Lee Rinehart with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. We hope you have enjoyed these excerpts of previous podcasts. All of our previous podcasts are available at the website forthesoil.org, and at the menu bar right there at the top of the page, just click on Podcast. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you should have a specific question about soil health, call your local extension office, contact your local USDA Service Center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.